Hello YouTube, this is Sadiko24 here, and I've been thinking about something lately, which is whataboutism. One of the most infuriating tendencies of people in an argument about geopolitics to go for. It's also something I have myself resorted to in some of my videos. My video in The Darkness on the Left, looking back, was a lot of whataboutism. And it was kind of almost an attempt to navigate the maze of whataboutism when it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue. What about October the 7th? Well, what about the Nakba? Well, what about the Holocaust? What about the expulsion of the Jews from Iraq? The Farhud? The expulsion from the Jews in Yemen? What about? And I used whataboutism. I also try to get to the bottom of where does whataboutism lead? Can whataboutism lead to the core issue again? And what is the core issue? The truth is, I never really intended to put my channel in this direction. I never really intended my channel to be about the Israel-Palestine war. When I started even doing videos about it, I was an absolute novice. I didn't have a clue about the history of the conflict, really. I just knew that it was, just another war in the Middle East. Sectarianism in the Middle East. And I just knew that Hamas were clearly the most evil side in this. What they'd done on October the 7th was supremely evil. And a lot of whataboutism I saw seemed to be from, at best, at my most charitable, from leftists, leftists who kind of ignored, who made the issue still about Palestine. At my most charitable, these were leftists who had not really come to terms with the fact that they're not in a pre-October the 7th world anymore. We are not in a pre-October the 7th world anymore. Same way that, there was a point we lived in a pre-9/11 world, and then after 9/11, the world changed. And people on the left who tend to resort to whataboutism are the kind of people who are just saying, basically the bottom line for them is, why has the world changed? Why did the world change on 9/11? If 9/11 changed the world, why didn't the bombing of Cambodia change the world? Why didn't Vietnam change the world? I mean, to a degree, Vietnam did change the world, but not in the same way that 9/11 changed the world. And you would say, well, 9/11 is just blowback from stuff from the past. October the 7th is blowback from stuff from the past. The focus should be on what it was blowback from. Like I said, I didn't really intend my channel to go in this direction. The very first video I did on the Israel-Palestine issue was a video called What Would the Doctor Do? And it was basically an attempt to address the more political direction that Doctor Who fandom has gone in over the last 5 to 7 years. Doctor Who fandom has become a lot more politicized. It's become a lot more kind of pandering to the social justice warrior woke crowd. And, Doctor Who was always left-wing anyway, but it was a show that you didn't necessarily have to be left-wing to appreciate for the most part. Doctor Who used to appeal to a lot of small C conservatives. It had to. It was a populist show, really. But it had little bits of political agitprop in there. And the point is that over the years, Doctor Who, the politics of Doctor Who started to matter in a way that it never did before. And the politics of being a Doctor Who fan started to matter in a way it never had before. We had a generation of new Who fans who had based their entire identity, their entire sense of conscience, social conscience, on what would the Doctor do? The Doctor had kind of become the image of their ideal conscience. And that video I did was basically about addressing the fact that how the Israel-Palestine issue, now that it was going to kick off again in Gaza, was likely to cause yet another division in Doctor Who fandom, a very partisan division. The video was an attempt to, in a strange way, it was supposed to be a peacemaker video between the two camps, the camps in fandom that were pro-Israel, the camps that were pro-Palestine, and say, look, let's not turn this into a culture war. Let's understand that both sides have their reasons to stand with whichever side they think has the most legitimate grievance. Israel suffered on October the 7th. There's reason to side with Israel. Palestinians have suffered before then, and they're suffering in this war. There's reason to side with them, or show the kind of, lean your empathy toward them, certainly. And we should have empathy rather than demonizing and dehumanizing the other side. And I meant this as much to the pro-Israel camp as much as the pro-Palestine camp. So look, they have their reasons for thinking this is the right thing to do. In terms of if your line of thought is, what would the Doctor do? They've got good reason to think, this is what, as a fan of this show, as a fan who kind of takes the morality of the show to heart, this is what I should do. But at the same time, it was also a kind of I also meant it to be a permission slip for saying, look, if you really think about it, maybe Doctor Who shouldn't be that important. Maybe Doctor Who should not be your moral guidance in life. It's best appreciated as a bit of fun, a bit of escapism, and in terms of morality, that's best ignored. Like, those were the best years of the show was when it didn't concern itself with that. And those days are kind of behind the show. Long behind the show, frankly. So that was where it started, but it wasn't supposed to really be the direction for my channel. Then I did a few more videos in response to a rather, frankly, harrowing interview that was on Piers Morgan's show with Jeremy Corbyn, in which Jeremy Corbyn we were deeper into the war by now. The death toll had started to rise, and I started to actually feel really bad for Corbyn and for the Palestinians he cared so much about. And I did feel that the way Piers Morgan conducted the interview was as a nasty inquisition. Regardless of what you may think of Corbyn, that interview did strike me as being a very nasty inquisition. And I did 2 videos on it because I was horrified at it, and I was upset about it, frankly. Deeply upset about it. I felt I had to say something on it. Now, those videos didn't stay up. I don't think they were very good. I think I kind of didn't think through those videos at all, really. So I did one more video, which was about the ceasefire itself. And then I did a video called A Window for Peace, in which I read aloud an account from a citizen of Gaza who talked about how Hamas runs Gaza. And he's saying, look, there is actually a mood in the air, a hope in the air that the people of Gaza are getting fed up of Hamas. And the defeat of Hamas might not necessarily come from Israel. It might come from the revolution of the people. It might come from an uprising of the people of Gaza who are just fed up of Hamas. The people of Gaza are getting fed up of Hamas. This is my hope for peace. And that was kind of supposed to be like, it was almost the final exorcism of my conscience on the matter, I thought. And I hoped that, because there was a hope I felt that, well, maybe this war is ending. Maybe this war will end soon. And that would have been it, frankly. I didn't really intend to do any more videos on the matter after that. I kind of hoped after that I could return to doing what I always planned to do, which was more Doctor Who videos. And then things got really complicated. Then South Africa got involved. Then the ICJ got involved. Then the corruption of the UN got surfaced. The deep corruption of the UN. And it's like suddenly I couldn't be silent. Suddenly I couldn't just, be I had to pick a side now. I couldn't just flip between sides anymore. I had to pick a side. The lawfare that was going on, I could see there was something petty and nasty about it. And that's what made me decide to make it a focus of my channel after all, because suddenly it started to unnerve me. It started to freak me out. It started to disgust me, frankly, the kind of lawfare that was being engaged in here that seemed to completely let Hamas off the hook after what they'd done on October the 7th.
We're not in the business of tricking anyone. You have said they're here to attend a conference. That conference is not a government conference. So I don't know how government must account for people who are coming to attend private conferences that are hosted in the country and to then say it's one group or the other. So I don't think there's much other value I can extend.
And I'll get into that in a bit, but let's talk whataboutism again. Okay. The Darkest on the Left was the next video I did, and that was kind of like, at that point I'd started to research the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict a lot more. I'd watched a film called Tantora, which was about a massacre that happened in the village of Tantora during Israel's war for independence, when the Israeli armies were enacting Plan Dalet, which was to expel the Palestinian villages.
שאספנו את התושבים, התחלקנו לחוליות חוליות ונכנסנו לחצרות, וכל חצר היה 50 איש, 40 איש. 50, 40? כן, כן, בתוכם חצרות, אבל הם פחדו, לבד הם לא יכולו, אז התקבצו בתוך חצרות כאלה. ונשק לא היה להם? לא, אלה תושבים כאילו, אלה תושבים.
1938 Creation Catastrophe was another one I watched, which was very much on the same kind of theme. And looked more at the Day Yassin massacre. And so that led me down the path of whataboutism of, well, actually, maybe the Palestinian camp do have something of a point about past grievances. Maybe they do have a point when they say it didn't start on October the 7th. Maybe they even have a point when they say the Nakba was, if you're Palestinian, then the Nakba was for the Palestinians, the Nakba was our October the 7th. And certainly when I watched Tantora, I thought, okay, I get what they mean.
כבשנו טנטורה, תפסנו הרבה ערבים, אספנו אותם. זה סיפור מאוד יופי. היה איזה 15, 20, שמרנו עליהם, פתאום בא אחד עם כובע אוסטרלי, יש לו אקדח, הוא צועק בערבית, גומו, קומו, הם קמו. הוא ניגש קרוב, ככה מסתכל. הוא הולך צעד אחרי, הוא מוצא את האקדח, הרג את כולם. אותי זה זעזע, דם קר, כן? אני אותו לא שאלתי, אני שאלתי. כאלה שידעו, למה זה? אין לך מושג כמה יהודים אלה הרגו. אין לך מושג. נגמר.
And so that was almost a kind of, is this a point where I retire from being partisan, from picking a side? And the thing is, the video was about the fact that I kept on coming back to that problem of, look, Hamas haven't been defeated yet. And the people who oppose Israel seem to side with Hamas, and they seem to side with Hamas's agenda to create greatest instability. In terms of whataboutism, suddenly it became important. What about Iraq? You say that Israel should be, disarmed, rendered defenseless, that it should be basically vulnerable to invasion. You would never have advocated that for Iraq, which was under a far more brutal, vile, genocidal leader and regime. And you said that, to do so is to just cause destabilization of the region. So why by your standards there, you should be against any sanctions against Israel, because that's just going to make the situation far worse. And I kind of realized that I'm not dealing with objective thinking people who are actually concerned with what's good for the region. What I'm dealing with is people who just hate Israel to an irrational degree, to the point where it's actually pushing them to be an absolute liability to global stability, certainly to regional stability in the Levant. And that was kind of the bottom line of the video is, look, because of the darkness on the left, because the left have become about that, I have to take a side, and I have to live with the fact that I've taken a side that does not exactly have the most saintly history. But at the same time, the video was also an attempt to kind of talk about the fact that there's two sides to Israel. It's vilified on one thing. It's vilified for the Nakba, it's vilified for the occupation and that, this and that. But then if you look at the surrounding Middle East, you look at what happened to the Jews in Iraq who were expelled in the Farhud, and same to the Jews in Yemen and Algeria and Iran and Morocco and so many other places in the Middle East. And Israel became a safe haven, a sanctuary for the dispossessed, the displaced and dispossessed, of Jews who had suffered their own version of the Nakba in surrounding countries. So, this idea that Israel's this colonialistic, it's founded on expulsion and ethnic cleansing. But then it became a safe haven for the ethnically cleansed and the expelled. At the same time, it's like one person's curse is another person's miracle. And Israel is kind of a state that defines that. And to a degree, a lot of, like Ilan Jono has said, in the occupation of the West Bank, at first, Israel, the Palestinians in the West Bank had a better thriving economy and quality of life than they would have had under the dictatorship of Jordan, which they were under during prior to the 1967 war. And same with the Palestinians in Gaza, which was ruled over by Egypt at one point before the 1967 war. Things were better, and then the Intifada kicked off, and then it became a brutal occupation. So whataboutism plays a part there. It's like, why are you offended about the fact that how the Palestinians are treated under Israeli occupation when you didn't care when they were under Egyptian occupation or Jordanian occupation? Or for that matter, when they were relegated to second-class citizenry in Lebanon, or when they were being bombed by Assad in the 2012 Syrian civil war. Whataboutism suddenly becomes kind of important to our side, to my side, and that's kind of the point. Is it just a cheap tool? And this does, to a degree, go back to the left's reaction to 9/11. And then the left's reaction to 9/11 was entirely couched in whataboutism. It was couched in something else as well. It was couched in a deep-seated hatred of America. But it was mingled with whataboutism. Because the bottom line is, when most of us see a conflict going on in the world, the average person thinks it's horrible, but it's none of our business. It's nothing to do with us. We don't know the full context of what's happening or why. It's all horrible. We should focus on affairs at home. We don't have the capacity to deal with it, really.
Where did you get this? Half a mile down the road.
Fred, it's David. I've got incredible footage. It's a massacre. Dead bodies, machetes. If If I get this through right away, can you make the evening news? Yeah.
Sorry about earlier. If I'd known you were in there, I wouldn't have.
I am glad that you have shot this footage and that the world will see it. It is the only way we have a chance that people might intervene.
Yeah, and if no one intervenes, it's still a good thing to show.
How can they not intervene when they witness such atrocities?
I think if people see this footage, they'll say, oh my God, that's horrible. And then go on eating their dinners.
And the left kind of tried to argue the same kind of thing. There'd be whataboutism about that, about, well, look, why should we care about that more than any other horror? There's always horrors in the world. It just seems to be the modern condition in the poorer regions of the world. In a grim way, it's the status quo there, I suppose. And it'd be nice if we could change it, but what can we do to change it? And I think with 9/11, it was kind of something the left could weaponize. They could say, well, because the entire argument against about 9/11 was, from the left, was whataboutism. It was all whataboutism. It's like, what about what America's done in the past? What about what America did in Cambodia? What it did in Vietnam or in Iraq during the First Gulf War? America's done a lot of evil things on the world stage. Right all the way back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can't just say that Al Qaeda is the only evil force in the world that has killed 1,000 in one day. America has done that. And so it was all about whataboutism. But the gist of it, of course, is they were saying, same way that most people would say of world conflicts, it's none of our business. Al Qaeda has a beef with America. We should stay out of it. Maybe Al Qaeda has good reason to have a beef with America. And of course, there was always the talk of the fact that America should not be allowed to take its beef out on, thousands of innocent civilians in Afghanistan. I mean, they would argue whataboutism to the point where you just felt numb from it, really. I remember I was there. My mum took me to some of these left-wing circles, and you just started to become numbed by it. It was mind-numbing. It was a mind-numbing environment of whataboutism. And to a degree, Iraq was kind of where it was almost the Iraq War was a gift to the left. It was a gift to their whataboutism, because then they could say, well, even if you think that 9/11 has something to do with us, what the hell does invading Iraq have to do with 9/11? And when people say, well, look, shouldn't we depose Saddam Hussein? And people will say, well, why should we depose Saddam Hussein and not all these other dictators that America's allied with? Why don't we depose the Saudi royal family? Why don't we depose the leaders of Uzbekistan, who we kind of give financial support to, even though they're torturing their citizens, or or the leaders of Pakistan? And it was all kind of whataboutism. And I do remember James O'Brien. I know he's a bit of a woke arsehole, but sometimes he did have a few kind of shrewd points. And he did once say about the Iraq War, about arguments for and against the Iraq War. He said, well, look, you're saying, well, because, why should we get involved? Why should we depose Saddam Hussein? Why is it our place to, when we don't take care of, all these other world stage kind of, tyrants? And he said, well, think about it. If you got all the world's worst war criminals lined up before you, and you got a gun with one bullet, do you decide you're not going to shoot any of them, or do you take that chance then to shoot one of them and rid the world of one of their, at least one, there'd be one less evil and force for evil in the world? and saying, look, this could be our one bullet chance to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Why don't we do it? Wouldn't the greater sin be to pass that up? And but the left always had this argument for how America was the one in the wrong. I think Saddam Hussein had once been a creation of America, creation of the West, or at least had been supported and propped up by the West back when he was ostensibly on our side in the Iraq-Iran war. So that's what I mean by whataboutism. That's how it's weaponized and that's how it's used. So it might sound strange that I've titled this video in defense of whataboutism. But the thing is, whataboutism is kind of a common condition. Most people, when they see the horrors going on in the world, they say, what's it got to do with us? It's horrible, but it's not really any of our business. It's for them to sort out, not us. And, if you show me charity to donate to, I will, just to help the people in this struggle, but that's about all I can and should do. I can't change things, and Iraq kind of became a case in point of what happens when you try to change things. You can end up making things far worse. And which, funny enough, it was the kind of the ground zero for my argument on the doctors on the left is, well, look, this movement to disarm Israel, that's going to have the same effect as the invasion of Iraq. It's just going to lead to regional destabilization. It's, a lot of people would say it's like South Africa, when there was the boycott against apartheid South Africa that forced them to change tack. The left are high on this idea that they can do the same thing to Israel. They're just going to make the region worse. South Africa was not in even half the volatile region that Israel is. South Africa was not under that much of a threat. South Africa could survive without apartheid, and it was right to do away with that, but to threaten to bring about the end and disappowerment of the Israeli regime after Hamas has demonstrated what it will do is just insane, as far as I'm concerned. And this is, of course, why whataboutism can have a point. Whataboutism in the case of Israel is that it's not just Israel to take into consideration. It's not just the sins of Israel to take into consideration, because a lot of these people who focus on Israel, they turn a blind eye to the enemies of Israel that surround it, to Hamas, to Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, and probably a lot of other surrounding nations that are probably secretly rooting for Hamas to win. And once you understand there's a deeper context than just the evil that Israel does ostensibly, or the evil that Hamas does ostensibly, even Hamas is just a smaller part of a bigger puzzle, then you understand whataboutism does matter. Context matters. Israel is not just some brutal, ruthless regime for nothing. Actions are kind of informed by the environment it's in and the scenario it is up against. If Israel existed in Europe, it would have probably, demilitarized, or it would kind of scale down its military measures by now, because it was in a favorable region of the world for it to be able to do that. It's not. It's in the Middle East. You have to think 1948, the Nakba, and compare it to 1945, the liberation of Auschwitz, the defeat of Nazism. There was a vested interest in Europe and in America as well to reconstruct Europe and to build peacemaking efforts that would ensure there would be peace. And to a degree, this did mean an occupation as well. It meant Germany had to be occupied to the point where it stopped being a threat, where it had been rehabilitated as a country into a denazified country. And it worked. there was an investment in making Europe a peaceful place because there were sound leaders in charge who understood that. And if you look at the Middle East, if you look at the Israel-Palestine issue, you realise, the deeper you look into it, the deeper you realise that the reason it's not been solved is because there's not been an interest in solving it. There's not been an interest in getting Israel to a cooperative place with its neighbours. Israel has made the effort, however. It did make its peace efforts with Egypt. Famously, President Sadat was murdered in 1981 for signing a peace deal. He was murdered by Islamist extremists, by the forebears of Al-Qaeda.
The man now being mourned earned his spurs as a soldier. As a young officer, Sadat led the efforts to expel the British from Egypt. In the Arab-Israeli conflict, he achieved more than any other Arab. Sadat won back territory that had been in Israeli hands since the '67 war. The restoration of the rest of Sinai became for Sadat a major objective of the peace. Yet for Sadat, normal relations with Israel was a means to an end. The fruits of peace were to be shared among Egypt's impoverished millions. They were to be used to break the spiral of poverty. Poverty in the countryside where overpopulation was forcing people off the land in search of a living in the city. As often as not, the objective proved a mirage. For in the cities, overcrowding was compounded by desperately high unemployment.
There's been tension in Cairo ever since the attack. Heavily armed troops are on guard at all public buildings, and black uniformed combat police surrounded the parliament for its first session following the murder of the president. Virtually every listed deputy turned up for that session, in what was both a tribute to President Sadat and a calculated display of the solidity of the Egyptian government. Among them, Egypt's defense minister, General Abu Ghazala. He was near President Sadat when the gunman opened fire, and in spite of his wounds, immediately took control of loyal troops around the podium. As the tributes to President Sadat went on, many of his friends and followers were unable to restrain their grief. Yet in the chamber there must still have been some who reflected on the strange enigma of the dead president. No one doubted the influence that fundamentalist mosques have on some sections of the population, but few had realized that Islamic fervor and even hatred had found roots in some sections of the armed forces. Last night, Minister of State Boutros Ghali confirmed for TVI that the soldiers who murdered President Sadat were Islamic fanatics.
I believe that there was a group of very marginal fanatics which belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood, and there was against the system as such.
The system, including the peace process, including the internal policies of the Sadat regime?
I believe it is not so much the peace process, but the system directed by President Sadat as such.
And I think that's kind of... like, you might probably wonder, in both my video with The Darkness on the Left and Abby Martin, the video I did on Abby Martin, in both of them I did ask that question about, does Israel have the right to exist? And some of you may think, well, why even entertain the question?
In my mind, if you talk about being an anti-Zionist, before the establishment of Israel, I think it was a reasonable position to hold. Israel shouldn't, many Jews, there was a debate about whether establishing a state of Israel was the right solution to centuries of persecution that had been suffered by the Jews. But after Israel's been established, for me it feels like the difference between speaking to your wife or girlfriend about whether you should have an abortion or killing the child when it's 5 years old, 10, when it's 6 months old, now 75 years old. It's different. The child's been born. The child's living. It's in the world. It's a person, like any other person. It's a country among other countries. And God knows the history of every country is steeped in violence and injustice and bloodshed. Do I need to mention about our own history? I don't. The American history that's founded on the genocide of indigenous people there, the Australian history, the French occupation of Algeria. I mean, come on. While Israel was engaging in these various wars that have become iconic in people's minds, Six-Day War, Britain had an empire. The Malayan emergency happened around that sort of time, and there were pictures that emerged of Royal Marine commandos holding up severed heads of Malaysians. Vietnam happened around that time, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were wiped out by the Americans. So there's this. So that's what I mean by the double standards or demonization of Israel.
The reason I entertained the question was because I'd watched Tantora, and I'd watched, learned about the massacre in Day Yassin. And Douglas Murray had done some videos. He did some interviews in which he talked about the fact that even after October the 7th, there was still some naive hopes in the American leadership that we could get the two-state solution done. And Douglas was saying that he found that, frankly, crass, because it meant that a two-state solution would become a reward for the massacre that happened on October the 7th. And that basically, to reward terrorism was to throw the victims under the bus. That, it would be a terrible thing if October the 7th became Palestine's birth of a nation moment. There would be nothing worse. There would be nothing more of an insult to the victims. Tantora briefly made me think that I should apply the same principle to the founding of Israel and say, should the massacre of Tantora have been rewarded with statehood for the Israelis? And so that's why I asked that question. It wasn't just a case of being, having a vendetta against Israel. It was an attempt to actually try to be ethically consistent. And to a degree, that's not easy. Because it's not 1948 anymore. And frankly, to be honest, I would say the question is moot. I'd say the question is completely moot now. Did Israel have the right to be founded that way or not? The fact is it has been. And whether it had the right to be created in 1948 by some very Machiavellian methods, and I'll kind of go into this. The fact of the matter is, I think over the years, over the decades, it has earned its right to exist. Absolutely earned its right to exist. It has made peace deals with Egypt. It has made peace deals with Saudi Arabia. It made humanitarian efforts in the Syrian civil war. It did more humanitarian efforts in that particular war than any other of its surrounding states did. Israel has earned the right to exist, as far as I'm concerned. It's more than earned the right to exist. More than earned the right to exist. But I think, moreover, lately I've started to kind of see Tantora in a different new light, which is, and this is a complete tangent, I'll get back to the main topic in a moment, but the fact that we've lost control of the streets, the fact that Islamists are marching on the streets demanding the gas the Jews, death of the Jews, and that it's been like this for a while. We've got a problem with Islamist extremism in the UK. Major problem. And the politicians are absolutely hopeless at getting a grip on it. And this is part of the reason, and we've lost control in terms of immigration as well. The realization is that we are screwed as a country. We are, and there are times when I do fear that maybe we are headed for civil war. And watching Tantura, I kind of feel like I understand in a horrible way what that civil war might be like. Because, a civil war is one in which there's no security, there's no safety. Social order is broken down. It's a wild, wild west, frankly. And it's a situation in which, frankly, in terms of the fighting, usually in war you can tell who the enemy is because they're wearing a uniform. In civil war, it's not so easy. And that's why often in civil war, identity politics plays such a part, and why it becomes a race war or an ethnicity war. And it's horrible. And I think Tantura is playing out what I think I know is going to be the case if civil war breaks out here. In civil war, I imagine there'll come a point where Muslim extremists are just killing any non-Muslim they see, and non-Muslim, those on the other side who are armed and out to shoot will probably just start shooting any Muslim they see. It'll just be a case of, we've got to kill the enemy. We've got to show no distinction between civilian and soldier because we don't know the difference. And we can't take any chances. It probably will get to that miserable point. And so from that, I actually began to understand what happened in Tantura. Civil wars are horrible, and they are won often by the nastiest side, and often by the side that has made the most provisions for what you have to do in a civil war to win. And, I suppose Tantura was also a kind of a remarkable piece because it kind of showed how does a society get from that to thriving country after? How is it that you would never have known that, these places in Israel were a battle zone once, were a bloodbath once. So anyway, to get back to the point I made. Okay. Whataboutism? And South Africa, and the ICJ, and the UN. This is where whataboutism becomes important. It becomes actually a really credible point to make. But first of all, I'll talk about the left's whataboutism. At first, I was willing to make allowances for the left's whataboutism. Or rather, I was willing to say, look, do the left really need to be subject to whataboutism? Yes, they principally care about this one issue of Israel and the treatment of the Palestinians. It's their pet cause, if you know what I mean. But the thing is, we all have our pet causes, and sometimes you've got to pick a pet cause because the entire spectrum of world horrors is there's so many to choose from. You can't just focus on every single one of them. So you've got to focus on what you feel in your heart you can do something about, or should do something about. And that's why I think which is kind of the problem with the Palestine cause, because it has become something of a dark industry. It's something that can be promoted. It's, social media can gain a lot of pay out of talking about the Israel-Palestine issue in a way that they can't seem to with other issues. And so the focus becomes on Israel and Palestine. Partly because we do have Palestinian refugees here in Britain, I suppose. But I can understand, the whataboutism. And to a degree, the point where you move from saying it's horrible, but it's none of our business is usually when, on some level, you've decided which side in this you hate. A lot of the propaganda is geared towards getting you to hate Israel. Now, I see this propaganda skeptically myself, but a lot of the left don't. They are swayed by the propaganda to hate Israel, and hatred of the enemy does lead often to empathy for the victims, and that's true for me as well. Because for me, it's the opposite. It was, to my mind, the Israel-Palestine issue for me was for a long time, a none of my business issue. I'm a neutral fence sitter. It's horrible, but I haven't decided on a side that's worse yet. I haven't picked my side yet. Or rather, the rotten sides in this was just the status quo. And I thought, well, look, it's never going to change, so what's the point getting angry about it? Because October the 7th changed the game, then I got angry about it, because this did not need to happen. And it did nothing to help alleviate the situation. It's like I said in that video on, where I compared the Israel-Gaza war to Rwanda. I said that the difference of October the 7th was that prior to then, I probably was willing to go along with the idea that Israel and Hamas, that is the Israeli government, and the IDF and Hamas, maybe they are just as bad as each other. Maybe they're both as bad as each other, I guess. And maybe because they're both as bad as each other, they both have to be equally ruthless with each other. There's a pragmatic reason, there's a utility to why they're ruthless with each other. October the 7th changed the game because suddenly I realized that Hamas weren't merely just as bad as Israel, and they weren't merely, ruthless, in adaptation to Israel. October the 7th proved to me that Hamas were evil. They weren't just as, it suddenly wasn't both sides being bad as each other. It was suddenly clear Hamas were evil. Hamas were just evil. And that changed the game. Majorly. Suddenly I had a side I hated in this war. And that plays the part in all of it. When it comes to the terrible things Israel has done in this war, when it comes to the tragedies that's been in this war caused by Israeli bombardment, like, for instance, when it was revealed that it was actually, when that business with the World Kitchen aid workers, and they were killed, I was devastated when it turned out that Israel had done the deed. There was causing an Israeli airstrike. I don't know the full story of what happened. I have heard some garbled reports that maybe it involved a particular bodyguard that was employed to World Health Kitchen, and it turned out this bodyguard was actually affiliated with Hamas, and so that the drone strike attack was meant to kill him, and it just ended up the aid workers were killed. That was the point where I was disappointed, deeply disappointed in Israel. I was sad and disappointed, but I wasn't angry at Israel. I was still angry at Hamas for starting the war. And when I realized that that's when I realized that I was past any threshold of whose side I'm on here. These minor quibbles about terrible tragedies, like the killing of Hind, the death of that little girl Hind, maybe that saddened me. I thought, oh no, I want Israel to be the kind of moral side in this. I want it to turn out that this is something in which Israel were not directly responsible for her death, and that it wasn't just a gratuitous kill. I want to believe that, but I need the evidence to support that. I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it yet. I need the evidence. I feel like I do. And well, with the World Health Kitchen thing, that was when I finally said, you know what? Doesn't matter to me. I realize now it doesn't matter to me. All that matters is that Israel wins this war against Hamas. Hamas started the war. Hamas is responsible for every death. I am past any conscientious objections about how Israel's conducting this anymore. All Israel has to do is win, as far as I'm concerned. Once they win, this ends. But that's the thing. When Israel is called out on something like this, my feeling is one of disappointment, but it's not anger at Israel. However, when video footage or articles show Hamas killing Palestinians, that's when I get angry. Like, there's a video I saw of some Palestinian, like a Muslim woman and in a hijab and a few others trying to seek shelter in this place that's owned either by Hamas or by some criminal faction. And they're trying to seek shelter from the bombing. And the Hamas militants, or whichever militant group they're in, they just start beating them and telling them, get out of here, you're not welcome. And they just, it's like you see the woman flinch and terrified as she's being terrorized by these people. And that's when the anger comes out of me, comes out, you fucking evil scumbags, this is evil. And I don't actually say, to my to everyone's surprise, this is the most evil thing I've seen in this war. And so we've like, this is the most evil thing you've seen in this war? It's like, yes, it is. Israel's waging this war because it has to. This is just gratuitous cruelty of Hamas to their own people. And it's like, this is where I felt empathy for the victims. And like Abby Martin and the likes of Abby Martin always try to frame this as we don't have empathy for them because they're brown or whatever. I realise that is bullshit. We just kind of become blanketly of the view that if they're in that war zone, then it's just inevitable that some of them are going to die, some innocents are going to die. And to me, the hostages was case in point, because I thought, as much as there was talk about keeping the hope of the hostages alive, which the left failed to do, incidentally, they did the opposite. The left could have gotten behind the point about the hostages in Gaza to say, their safety matters. This bombing campaign is threatening their safety as well. But I was resigned to the fact that, look, maybe they're not going to make it out alive. And maybe Israel is going to have to kill these hostages in the process of killing Hamas. And the bottom line is destroying Hamas. And so it was almost like the hostages became like the civilian collateral in Gaza. Didn't matter that they were Israeli, didn't matter they were innocent. It's like they're just collateral, they're casualties of war. We have to think of the possibility they may be casualties of war. If it defeats Hamas, killing them, then it's horrible, but maybe it's worth it in the long run. The silver lining is that Hamas are beaten, and we got to focus on the silver lining. And that kind of told me it's bollocks that it's to do with racism. It's not to do with racism. It's to do with the dynamics of the war. But like I said, if you hated Israel already, then you're going to hate them even more for what they're doing in Gaza. Whereas for me, I'd started hating Hamas. And so I hated Hamas in a way that meant that it's the cruelty they did to their own side, to their own people, that tended to get me to sympathize more with the Palestinians. Like, those Palestinians, they could have been killed by Israel, and maybe I wouldn't have given a damn. But the fact they were being killed by Hamas made me give a damn, and it humanized them as victims of Hamas, of an evil that I hated. And it kind of... And I suppose also it was because it was a gratuitous cruelty. And because I realized that... And that's the bottom line, I think, really. October the 7th changed everything. The prospect of peace ended there. And something more. So, I get that the left is biased, and I get that they hate Israel. That's just the nature of the left, and to a degree, it's such a core part of human nature that maybe I was willing to charitably say it doesn't necessarily make them anti-Semitic. It doesn't necessarily, I can understand why they'd be frustrated at whataboutism. But then whataboutism becomes important when it comes to the UN, when it comes to South Africa's case. Because then suddenly the question, why, what about Syria? What about Uganda? What about Sudan? What about China's, treatment of the Uyghurs? It's like, you're bringing this case against Israel. Where the bloody hell were you during the Syria war? Where the bloody hell were you during this? For that matter, where were you when Hamas started this fucking war? Why weren't you bringing a case against Hamas that would have seen Hamas arrested, put in The Hague, locked up for life where they belong, or preferably guillotined like they deserve. And this entire war could be avoided. Where were you? And that's where whataboutism becomes crucial and important, because these great bodies are not supposed to pick, enemies they hate more than any other. They're supposed to be impartial. They're supposed to be fair and just. That's what they're sainted to be. That's what they're revered for being. And this is where whataboutism kind of becomes important. And the fact that they're not shows you, the fact that Israel is being especially punitively condemned shows you the source of the problem. This is where whataboutism matters, because no one's answering the question, what about? And when South Africa were asked, do you condemn Hamas? They said, we have not recognized Hamas as a terrorist organization. That's where the whataboutism matters. It's like, well, if you care about the Palestinian people, why would you support a vile tyranny like Hamas that kills its own people? Which proves you don't care about the Palestinian people. You're just using lawfare to condemn Israel. Why are you doing that? What's your sinister agenda here? What's your petty agenda here? And that's why whataboutism sometimes matters. Because sometimes you've got to ask that question. If you don't ask that question, you can't get to the core of the issue. Whataboutism can shield things. I mean, going back to this whole thing about, because the left's kind of apologist take on Al-Qaeda, its attempts to paint Al-Qaeda as, resistance fighters, or just, a blowback from America's wrongs. This is where, and, it's an attempt to kind of nullify the instinct to hate Al-Qaeda. What about? Numbing you to the point where you think, well, okay, you're right, there's all kinds of evils. Maybe we shouldn't really be that concerned about Al-Qaeda. It's just one more evil out there. Hitchens wouldn't let that go. Rightly so. He did his research into why we should hate Al-Qaeda more than any other evil out there.
I'm very much troubled by your remarks about the need to stand up and fight this Muslim jihad. I have no time for oppressive religion of any stripe, but I think you are well aware of the long history of crimes committed by the British government in Iraq, the United States government in Vietnam, and today in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm wondering how you can possibly say that it is Western civilization, the civilization of the colonizers and the oppressors, who do it all, of course, in the name of liberation and democracy, how this is not the fundamental problem, rather than what you call the jihad of what I consider to be the response to the crimes of U.S. and European imperialism.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. There you have it. You see how far the termites have spread and how long and well they've dined. When someone can get up and say that in a meeting of unbelievers, that the problem is Western civilization, not the Islamic threat to it. That's how far the termites have got. Now, as a matter of fact, sir, I could have asked that question 50 times better than you did and answered it 50 times as comprehensively. If you like, I can, without conceit, refer you to a biography of mine of Henry Kissinger. That is a compendium and anthology of the war crimes committed by the United States and its allies in the Third World and elsewhere, and a call for those people, those responsible, to be arraigned for crimes against humanity and war crimes. It's a cheap paperback published by the New Left Review that anyone can get hold of, and I can't recommend too highly. One of those crimes, I'll just give you an example to show how utterly fatuous your implication is. One of those crimes was the arming and training of the Indonesian armed forces to take over the Republic of East Timor some of you are no doubt aware of this terrible atrocity, it's one of Noam Chomsky's best campaigns in writing, leading to the very near physical extirpation of the people of East Timor. A genocide more comprehensive than Cambodia, taking place a little afterwards, with our weapons, with our diplomatic protection, and with the endorsement of Kissinger and Ford. Hands up those who roughly remember this. Okay, not as good as I'd have liked, but still, and sad, but bear it in mind and look it up. Now, what are some of the items of the Al-Qaeda bin Laden manifesto? Well, oddly enough, and this was to my surprise, I thought it would be lower down. Item 3 in the charge against the West is that it reversed course on East Timor, tried to undo the genocide, brought East Timor to a referendum on independence, sent Jose Vieira de Mello, one of the greatest, Sergio Vieira de Mello, one of the greatest UN civil servants, to East Timor to supervise the transition to independence and the election, and made East Timor the newest member of the UN. Bin Laden says, "For this we will never forgive the Christian Crusaders and their imperialist friends. They took away a republic from a Muslim land, Indonesia." Most of the people of East Timor, by the way, are Christian and speak Portuguese. A detail. For this, we will never forgive them. For this, that was the reason they gave for blowing up the UN office in Iraq, because that's where Melio was sent next, with a truck bomb of explosives so enormous that it must have been borrowed from the former Iraqi army and Ba'ath Party. That's the reason they gave for blowing up the Australian tourists in Bali, in Indonesia, and the Indonesian taxi drivers who were servicing that resort, because they couldn't forgive the West for its behavior in East Timor. In other words, if you want to avoid upsetting these people, you have to let Indonesia commit genocide in East Timor. Otherwise, they'll be upset with you. You'll have made an enemy. If you tell them they can't throw acid in the faces of unveiled women in Karachi, they will be annoyed with you. If you say, we insist, we think that cartoonists in Copenhagen can print satire on the Prophet Muhammad, you've just made an enemy. You've brought it on. You're encouraging it to happen. So unless you're willing to commit suicide for yourself and for this culture, get used to the compromises you'll have to make and the eventual capitulation that will come to you. But bloody well don't do that in my name, because I'm not doing it. You surrender in your own name, leave me out of it. I'm going to fight these people and every other theocrat all the way. All the way. For free expression, for women's rights, for self-determination of small peoples, for the right of Iraqis to federate and have their own show, for the right of the Lebanese not to be bullied by Hezbollah and to have a multicultural democracy. Yes, I'll fight for this, and I think that the 82nd Airborne is brave to be fighting for it too. And I think you should be ashamed sneering at people who guard you while you sleep. Thanks.
He did his research into what Al-Qaeda is about, what its grievances are, and he realised that they were warped and twisted beyond any comprehension. There was no reasoning with them, and that it was absolutely right to kill them, to wage war on them and destroy them. And he also did his research into reasons to despise the kind of leftists who resort to whataboutism. And because of that, he kept the righteous hate alive against not only Al-Qaeda, but the fatuous apologist arguments that defend them. Because that tends to be why people don't really ask too many questions of Hamas. It's like, well, Hamas is just one more Islamic terrorist group out there, and we shouldn't focus too much on it, because if we talk about it too much, then doesn't that mean we're being Islamophobic? Doesn't that mean we're being Islamophobic? Doesn't that lead us towards being like the Islamophobic right wing? And we can't bear to be like the Islamic right wing because we're persona, if we do that, then we're persona non grata in our own side, and we are on the side of evil suddenly. That's why the left can't, change the tack. And there's another reason why, because that's the point. Going back to, I nearly retired my political side of the commentary after my video on, a window for peace. South Africa got me involved because I could tell there was a nasty, petty lawfare going on here. and that it was just vindictive. It wasn't really about justice, it was just about being vindictive. And it was the first opening into just the nasty world of international politics and the nasty state of the modern UN.
It means that they don't care about the lives of Palestinians, they don't care about the lives of Iranians, they don't care about the lives of Syrians. When before ISIS, the Islamic Republic, Qasem Soleimani and Quds Revolutionary Guards, they were in Syria. Why? They were killing civilians, ordinary people who were protesting against Bashar Assad. My heart is broken when I see that for years and years we have been warning the rest of the world, the democratic countries, that Khamenei and his gang of killers, they are not going to just stay in Syria. They're going to go everywhere. So what actually breaks my heart, that Khamenei even is good to mobilize other dictators, other authoritarian regimes without having common ideology. Putin, Maduro,
even Hamas,
China.
Sunni.
Yeah, they don't have anything in common when it comes to ideology. So that's why I say survival and ideology. For their own survival, dictators need each other. That's why when you see all the authoritarian regimes all over the world, they're backing each other. Different way, technology, surveillance. At the United Nations, voting for each other, backing each other, supporting each other. Transnational repression, they're supporting each other. They give military actions, economic. Anything that you see these dictators, they're filling the dots, they're filling the gap. They're supporting each other. They teach each other how to evade sanctions. So for that, they only care about power, stay in power, survival. They support each other, they have each other.
And that the UN, if you really look into the UN, it is not a body that ensures justice and fairness and peace. It is a body whereby it's a democracy of tyrants, where occasionally tyrants will align, as tyrants and socialists will align on a shared agenda to vilify one state and one state only, and it's usually Israel. Like, Israel have far more resolutions against it than North Korea does. That's where whataboutism matters. Suddenly you realise whataboutism if you ask what about, then you understand there's a rot in the UN. There's a bias. There's a creepy agenda to the UN that is not interested in what's fair. That doesn't really care about the Palestinians. It just has a vendetta. And this whole war has been one sad and shameful exposure to the world, I think. Or it should be. It's only been an exposure to me of just the sheer nasty pettiness of the Middle East. You know, that they would rather enact their grievance against Israel than do what's good for the stability of the region. And what's good for the stability of the region is to back Israel in its fight against Hamas and its fight against Iran. You know, a peace deal with Saudi Arabia would be beneficial for the region. Isolating Iran would be good for the region. You know, but a lot of these states are committed to the idea of, well, we just never really liked Israel. And this goes back to the fact that Israel has done a lot to earn its right to exist. And it's the kind of point where you realize how much Israel has fought to earn its right to exist over the years since 1948, and how much the surrounding regions have never changed, really. They've always been just rotten regimes. And they still are. They're still rotten, petty regimes that just want to drag back the old hostilities, the old wars. And that's why whataboutism matters. That's why whataboutism can be a useful thing. Whataboutism can sometimes lead you to the roots of a real problem. Because if the UN was fair with Israel, then I think we would agree that, I think then I absolutely could get behind them. If you look at the UN's history, you realize it's not been fair and that it has no credibility to criticize Israel fairly. If you can't criticize all sides equally, then you can't say that, if the UN worked at keeping the hostilities of its neighbors in check, then Israel would have far less excuse to act the way it does. The fact that the UN doesn't bother, to me, gives Israel carte blanche to. It's like, well, they have to be more ruthless. So you can realize the UN is not interested in making peace, and October the 7th proved that. Prior to then, I would never really notice the bias against Israel. I would have thought, well, yeah, Israel probably is doing some things worthy of criticism. But when suddenly it's being criticized for doing what it has to do against an enemy like Hamas that has made peace impossible, that's when you notice the rot. You notice a rot that goes all the way to the top.
Good evening. In a speech he was due to deliver the day after he died, Franklin Roosevelt called the United Nations the greatest contribution that any generation of human beings can make in this world. Soon after, his wife Eleanor called the moral foundation of the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Magna Carta for men everywhere. On the Belfast streets where I grew up, peace, justice, and human rights often seemed like distant dreams. But I took those powerful words to heart. And when I got a job at the UN, I thought I had my dream job. I would be able to ensure those principles were other children's reality. But what happens when this greatest contribution to the world fails to live up to its own standards? What happens when even UN staff violate the international Magna Carta? And when the UN's chief investigator admits he fakes inquiries, and I quote, to get the Americans off the UN's back. Who guards the guardians then? UN Watch does. They refuse to play the go-along to get along game that diplomats, bureaucrats, and other NGOs play at the UN. Hillel himself put it perfectly. Ambassadors prefer to avoid confrontations so they can get in their Mercedes and enjoy a quiet weekend in comfort, he said. It's the path of least resistance to keep good relations. I'll say the quiet part out loud. It's not just the ambassadors. When I reported that my boss was handing names of human rights activists to Beijing, I was still idealistic enough to believe that UN managers would care. They didn't. They offered me a promotion and money for my silence. I was still idealistic enough to believe NGOs like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch would care. I was wrong. They simply ignored a human rights abuse happening right in front of them to preserve their access to UN bureaucrats. But UN Watch did care, just like they do when the UN covers up child sex abuse, hires corrupt or anti-Semitic officials, or hands the human rights reins to Iran, Russia, and China.
Moreover, you realize that Israel has never been able to win a just war. It's not being allowed to win a just war. Because instinctively, I think we all know how just war works. Just war is based on the idea that, crucially, for a war to be just, it has to have a reasonable grounds of success to justify the civilian collateral that it will involve. If the operation is doomed to fail, then the war becomes null and void. It becomes immoral because you killed all those people for nothing. There was no positive outcome to justify the slaughter. Israel could win this war. And it seems that the only reason it's not being allowed to is by rogue states, by the UN resolutions, and by South Africa's lawfare, by the ICJ's lawfare that wants to make sure Israel fails, that wants to sabotage Israel's war effort to win. And if it does that, then it makes this an unjust war. It's not given Israel a chance to make this a just war yet. Because unfortunately, their camp is based on the idea of forcing Hamas to win an unjust war by unjust means. And an organization that does that, and that has seemingly nurtured Hamas as a proxy for decades, or certainly an Arab League in the UN, which has always nurtured the Palestinians to be that kind of anti-Israeli proxy. You realize that they're not interested in just war. They're on the side of Hamas winning an unjust war. And that none of this is about ensuring peace. And so a lot of people who feel that they're on the right side of history because the UN is on that side, they probably should do some research into what the UN's agenda is. Because it's not peace. It's not fairness. It's not a better world. And that's the point. Most of us trust that at least, if it's an unfair world, at least there are institutions like the UN trying to do some good work to make it a slightly fairer world. Revealing the rot in the UN has forced us to realize that we were wrong. And that if there's going to be a fairer world, there's either not going to be a fairer world, or if there is, the UN are our enemies in that struggle for a fairer world. They're not our allies, they're not our friends. Because they don't really care. And it's up to you whether you decide that means that we don't care about any of it and we just give up, or whether we decide, because the UN don't care, we have to. And it's kind of, we've got to start from ground, and if we do care, then we have to start from ground zero of how we pick our battles about what we care about. Because I think if there's going to be any redemption for the left, there's any common cause to be forged in this, any possible common cause, which is incredibly unlikely because of just how rotten the left have been in this. How frankly fascist the left have been in this, Nazi-like the left have been in this. Then, in the heart of hearts of the noble side of the left, despising the rot of the UN should be their cause too, as much as it's ours. And if only we could unite on that, then maybe we could begin to get to a genuinely less worse world. I won't be flowering and say we could get to a better world, but the UN offers the hope we can enforce a better world. And we should never forget that we were sold a lie by that bureaucratic, corrupted body of rogue states that call themselves the United Nations. And that use lawfare not to correct injustices, but simply to punish democracies.
We unanimously conclude that there are reasonable grounds to believe that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, including starvation as a method of warfare, murder, persecution and extermination. I served on this panel because I believe in the rule of law and the need to protect civilian lives. Douglas, what's your response to that?
These are all more preposterous political ideologues pretending to be cool, level-minded lawyers. Helena Kennedy is a far left-wing career political operative in the UK. She spent her whole life campaigning for loony left causes and giving them some legal patina. Amal Clooney, another highly motivated political operator. In her case, doubtless she will use this to raise more funds for the Clooney Foundation and to burnish her own credentials in some other way. But if you just consider what they've done there, first of all, these preposterous so-called judges and lawyers have done no on-the-ground research, nothing original. They haven't been into Gaza. They haven't been in any of the areas of the fighting. So when they say we find that Benjamin Netanyahu could have overseen murder in a war zone, they don't even know that it has happened. I mean, I suspect there is some killing in a war zone. It strikes me as being kind of de rigueur, and that's why Hamas shouldn't have started a war. But the other thing these people have done is, as I said earlier, Khan decided to go for the one Jewish state in the world. But he waited and did it at the same time as going for, or claiming that he's going to go for, Sinwar, the Hamas leader who planned and organized the 7th of October massacres. So what he's doing is this neat political, I would say even Islamist ideological thing, which is if you can't get through in the way you want, you pretend there is moral parity between Hamas and the IDF, between Sinwar, who planned the 7th of October atrocities, and Benjamin Netanyahu, whose task it is, the unenviable task of getting the hostages home and punishing the leadership of Hamas. They have just drawn an equivalence between those two things. I think it's, as I say, highly motivated, highly political at best. The whole thing stinks of an agenda. And I would just say that everybody who's just stumbled upon the International Criminal Court should remember, again, it isn't what it says it is. It has no jurisdiction in these matters, and nor should it. If it is agreed that these highly motivated individuals can come for Benjamin Netanyahu and the Minister of Defense Gallant, they will be coming for an Australian Prime Minister next, or a British Home Secretary, or an American Secretary of State, and they have no more right there.
The UN is the snake's head of our clown world. It's the snake's head of our problems with anti-Semitism. The slippery slope of anti-Semitism when it comes to the anti-Israel camp, because it is a tool whereby Israel is vilified unduly just for being a Jewish state that the Middle East have never forgiven for existing on what was once Muslim lands. The left has been drawn into an ancient blood war that actually in some ways started with the Nazi influence, or certainly had a resurgence thanks to Nazi influence. You know, there are a lot of people who will say Palestinians were the victims of World War II. You know, the Jews were expelled, the Jews who sought refuge in Palestine, the Palestinians suffered for the sins of Nazis, of European Nazis. You know, the Palestinians were innocent victims. No, they weren't. Or at least their leadership wasn't. Their leadership was absolutely, or their kind of chief cultural influences weren't. They were absolutely in bed with the Nazis. You know, the Nakba could have gone either way. Only one Nazi side could have won, but both sides were intent on ethnically cleansing the other. And only one side could win. But bear in mind what side, you know, the other side could have won as well. And it would have been just as horrific. It would have been Hitler's legacy if they had. You could say it was Hitler's legacy either way, but it was Hitler's legacy. So yes, whataboutism is not always just a gaslighting tactic to obfuscate. Sometimes it can lead to the rotten truth that many of us have never even considered. It could be the path to disillusionment as well. But even disillusionment is a start. The start of a new understanding of what's going on. Anyway, this is Sadako24, signing out.